All right. We are pleased to be talking today about the book A Time to Build by Yuval Levin. The panel name is Institutions, Formative or Performative. And this is a reference to one of the key insights and sort of hooks that sort of structure the book that Mr. Levin has written. Yuval Levin is a journalist, public intellectual, editor of National Affairs, director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at AEI, at American Enterprise Institute, an author of several books, two most recent ones, The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Left and Right. Also, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. Now, the latest book, the book that we're going to be talking about today, A Time to Build, is a short book, and it's one of those books that I think generally would sort of fall into or be consigned to, you know, literature on national self-improvement. We all have problems, you know, and those problems have been the subject of an unending stream of books over the years, some of which have had, I think, more staying power than others, some of which don't age very well. I recall a book, I can't remember the author, but The Death of Outrage, I think, is a book that has not aged well, at least in terms of the title, nor in the subsequent history of its author. It's a risky, I think, business to be in, because you never know actually how much time will either validate or vindicate your argument, or how you'll begin to look maybe a little bit dated more sooner than you wish you had been. In any event, this is a book that is diagnosing a problem and proffering a solution. And what I find sort of distinctive about this book, and one reason why I wanted to talk about it, bring people together to share opinions and insights, is that it connects sort of two issues that that have been sort of rumbling around in my own mind for a very long time. And it has to do, on the one hand, with whatever sort of institutional or structural pathologies we might find in American life, public life, social, political, cultural. We have problems with our institutions on the one hand, and then we have clearly a sort of a set of behavior issues that increasingly trouble people. You can sort of broadly encapsulate it in under the rubric of civic discourse or lack of civic discourse. And there's no end, sort of lack of arguments that either take one side or the other, focusing on sort of structural issues in American public life versus those that concern people's behavior. It's oftentimes, and as political scientists, at least this political scientist, I tend to always sort of been gravitating towards the structural kinds of arguments. I think of a magisterial work like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, where, you know, at the end of this very long book, you're sort of there alone watching TV in the dark, and that's a problem. I think of Theda Skocpol, her book on diminished democracy, where she sketches out, I think in a very persuasive way, the disintegration of a certain kind of organizational life that existed in the United States up until the mid-20th century. So the structural part of the political scientist, that's the one that I tend to gravitate towards. Very seldomly, though, do I see a book that so deftly connects structural diagnosis with its implications for individual behavior. Very, very infrequently do I see a book that does this, like Yuval Levin's A Time to Build. And that's why I thought it was a book that really is it's worth talking about. It's worth reading. It's a short book. It's a clearly written book. It's very elegant, accessible prose. I'm on no retainer whatsoever. I'm not getting a kickback, but I recommend this book to everybody if you've not been able to read it. Now, I mentioned the issue of institutions being formative and performative. That is, I think, the device in the book that knits together his overview of a number of areas of American public life. That's the one that bridges the question of institutions and individual behavior, and I hope that we can have a productive discussion about that. I want to briefly turn it over to Yuval Levin, and I'm sure you've been delivering a rap about this book in various circumstances. I've heard some of them on the radio, and so if you could talk for a few minutes about your book, we would be honored.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. The honor is mine. It's really wonderful to see it discussed like this by serious people who take time to read it and to think about it. And so I'm very grateful for the chance. I'll be very brief. I mean, I can certainly offer a kind of overview of the case, but maybe I would begin with the reason for the book, which is, I work at a public policy institution. I'm a kind of recovering political scientist myself, but I work in Washington and have for a long time now, and work at a think tank that is supposed to be devoted to public policy. And what we have found in the last now 10 years is that there is a shortage, a dearth of public policy discussion in Washington, and that the reasons for that have to do with problems that are upstream of the policy sphere. Our politics isn't really about public policy, and we're going through a almost completed presidential race here that had remarkably little to do with public policy, but that is somehow about some other set of problems that we can all see and discern but can't quite name, and that we're fighting about very intensely, but haven't, I think, entirely understood. There's just this sense that we're living through some kind of social crisis. And as you say, it shows both in what we might think of as broad kind of structural problems, like our polarization and partisanship. It shows itself in the kind of resentments and culture war struggles that we have in so many arenas. But it also shows itself, I think, in a related way in people's personal lives, in a sense of alienation, a sense of despair sometimes. It has to do, I wouldn't claim that it explains, but it has to do, I think, with the rise in opioid abuse and suicide rates. These things are somehow connected to each other. And it's not easy to put your finger quite on how they are connected. I think part of the reason it's not easy is that we tend to think about our public life, our common life in America, in rather individualistic terms. And so we imagine our society as a kind of big open space that's filled with individuals who are having trouble linking hands. And so we talk about addressing that problem by breaking down walls, or by building bridges, or leveling playing fields, or casting some kind of unifying narrative, all of which I think would be valuable. This description isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. And what it's missing is that we need not just greater connectedness, but some kind of structure for social life, a way to give shape and purpose and concrete meaning and identity to the things that we do together. So that if our country's life is a big open space, it's not just a space filled with individuals, it is filled with these structures of social life, with institutions. And at the heart of the book is an idea of institution that it's a very Aristotelian idea of what institution means. Obviously, the term institutions can be defined in a variety of ways and has been defined in a very wide variety of ways. But I think of institutions as the durable forms of our common life, the shape, the structure of what we do together. Some institutions, of course, are truly formal, structured, corporate. Some are much more informal, from the family to a profession to the rule of law, but they all have in common that they structure our common life, and they give us a role in relation to other people in the service of a common aim in ways that are just essential ultimately to social life. And there is a problem at that level of American life at this point. Part of the problem is that we've been losing trust in our institutions. And we know that, and that's reached the level of a cliche now in American life. But I think we don't quite often ask ourselves what we mean by that. What does it mean to lose trust in an institution, or even just to have trust? I think part of what it means is to believe that the institution is competent, is capable of doing the task that is assigned to it in our society. But part of what it means is also that we think the institution is formative, that it shapes people to be trustworthy. And to carry out that task, whether that's educating children or performing a service or governing the country, making laws, enforcing them, that it does that in a way that engenders an idea of integrity that can be trusted. And we trust an institution when it seems to form trustworthy people and to give them incentives to be trustworthy as they do their work. That means we lose trust when we lose that sense that the institution creates trustworthy people, That can happen through straightforward corruption, when an institution fails to overcome the vices of the people in it and instead protects them or shields them somehow, when a bank cheats a customer, when a priest abuses a child. These are institutional corruptions that obviously undermine our trust. But I think it also happens, and in some ways this is a distinctly contemporary institutional problem. It can happen when the institution stops viewing itself as formative and instead comes to play a role that is more performative, that it provides the people in it with a platform to stand on and be seen and raise their profile, build their brand. Rather than shape them, it offers them a mode of expression. And I think a lot of our institutions have gone through this kind of transformation. The book goes through those. You see it in our politics, particularly in Congress, the institution that I know best and care about most in our politics, has really become a kind of platform for individual brand building and cultural expression, much more than a mold of legislative activity. And as that has happened, the institution has become less functional. The book tries to think a little bit about the implications of this kind of transformation in different arenas of American life, the political, the professional, the academic, the religious, and cultural, and tries to think some, too, about what might be done. Obviously, books like this share in common a kind of weakness that after analyzing in great detail some grand problem, they then offer some sort of list of things to do that seems like it's nowhere near the scope of the problem, and in any case it's just whatever the author has always wanted government to do anyway. And there's some of that in this book, I admit, but on the whole, I think that what's necessary for this kind of problem to be taken up looks much less like a policy agenda and much more like a change of attitude. It looks like asking ourselves a question that is too rarely asked now in American life, which is, given the role that I have here, the institutional role that I have, whether that's as a member of this family or as a professional or as an employer or an employee or as a president or a member of Congress, given the role I have, what should I be doing here? To start to understand our responsibilities through an institutional lens can help us understand the purpose of the institutions of our society, can help us see the ways that they might constrain us, but in ways that can also empower us, and can also help us understand what to demand and expect of some of the elites in our society who have been failing the institutions that they're part of. And so gradually and from the bottom up to start to address this problem. That's a very broad overview, and I'm happy to talk about whatever speaks to folks, but that's a sense of where I come from and where the book came from.
Okay. Let me just respond just very quickly, and then I'm going to open it up. Ryan, you want to be after me, and then Guy, and then if James is around, then he can chime in. If not, then we'll just very quickly open it up to everybody else. I find myself being quite sympathetic to the general thesis about institutions, and in particular the notion that their decay is particularly manifested in the rise of a kind of performative, people in effect being parasitic on institutions and treating them as springboards for their own interest rather than allowing themselves to be shaped by the norms and conventions of the institution. And the idea that's almost, that there's something homologous. It's almost like corruption in a sense. It's not the corruption of necessarily lining one's pockets, although that's a pretty egregious example. It's also the idea that people would use institutions, wouldn't take them seriously, but see them simply as something I'm going to do now in order to position myself for some future act of self-serving aggrandizement. Being a political scientist, Congress, your chapter on Congress, the institutions, president, the judiciary, was the one that immediately sort of I felt most familiar with. And I think there, a lot of what you say is quite consistent with longstanding analyses of the breakdown of Congress comity, norms, C-O-M-I-T-Y, norms, the inability of the institution to function as it's supposed to, and yet when I stopped and asked myself, what is it that I'm supposed to expect from each institution, I realized that in the argument you're developing, there is a kind of either implicit or explicit sense of what's normatively appropriate for each institution. Like, how should Congress actually operate? and there are functional and dysfunctional versions of it. How should a family operate, right? What is the purpose of a family? Is it, and given that purpose, what configurations best serve those purposes? Whether it's the family, whether it's higher education, whether it's the media, there is I think unavoidably so, an assertion that there are proper ways for these institutions to function and therefore proper purposes for them. And there are other purposes that are distracting at best or perhaps undermining of institutional integrity at worst. And that it leads, I think, to observations and insights that sort of cross over left and right. I mean, I know where you're coming from professionally and whatnot, but the book certainly isn't written that way, right? It's clearly a book that can be picked up by anyone of good faith, and you can read into it and find some of the same things that trouble you. And that's what I really value about the thing that you've written. Ryan. Your voice, unmute.
I was doing that all through the class that I taught today as well. I was constantly, my students had to wave their hands and let me know that I was needed to unmute. I think it's because I'm so distracted by the election that I can't sort of adequately focus on the task at hand. That being said, I just want to thank our guest, Yuval, for kindly joining us and allowing us the opportunity to discuss your work with you. I found the book to be quite fascinating, and largely because it harkened back to what I would characterize as sort of this conservative communitarianism that was quite in vogue, of course, in the 90s, this 80s and 90s, but this effort to philosophically diagnose the deficiencies or perceived deficiencies in liberalism as a system of politics and as a set of prescriptions for governing institutions. And what I wanted to try and understand was the extent to which this conservative communitarianism sort of informs this work, this book. And I also wanted to get a better sense of the extent to which Plato's conception of justice in the Republic seems to be almost a subtext, at least on my reading of the book, and I likely could be incorrect, of course, but seems to be a subtext in the book in the sense that part of renewing our institutions is understanding our place in those institutions and being willing to act in accordance with our place in those institutions. And of course, I think there might be a bit of a tension between this sort of conception of institutions and what are the aspirational ideals of this experiment we call the United States. And I think those aspirational ideals are sort of best articulated in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, this idea that all are created equal and that we're all endowed with certain divine rights, including the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I wonder how we can renew our institutions in the way in which you suggest, and yet still preserve some degree of commitment to these aspirational ideals, which in many ways lend support to an exaggerated sense of the self, to this sort of individual atomism that communitarianism in particular noted was a deficiency in the broader liberal project. And so I was very much taken by the book in the sense that it brought me back to an earlier era of my life as a political scientist and sort of thinking and pondering about these two very interesting schools of thought. And I certainly would like to get your sort of views and comments on that. I'll stop there. Loren is who follows me? I'm sorry, I think it was Guy.
Let's do Guy next.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Glad to be here. I'm glad for the opportunity. I'm sympathetic to anybody with Aristotelian leanings, but I want to float maybe an alternate explanation and see what the author thinks about this. As I was reading through the, evidence of, from public polling about loss of confidence, loss of trust, I wondered if there wasn't maybe a pseudo problem. In other words, what I want to try to focus in on was the diagnosis the right diagnosis? So for example, I think it's right in chapter 1, right, where you acknowledge that, like, look, according to recent work by a lot of folks synthesized by people like Steven Pinker, things are getting pretty darn fantastic in the past 200 years or so. And yet there's still all this like confidence loss. And I'm wondering if there isn't just something like a self-awareness problem where, look, in fact, if you looked at people's lives and their behaviors, what you might find is that they still exercise like a significant amount of trust in institutions and their purposes, but they just don't perceive that to be the case. So for example, if I really had like strong mistrust, say, of my local government, how willing would I be to like drink the tap water or send my child to public school? Or in the chapter about universities, if I really do say, like, if I'm one of these people that report, just rank pessimism about higher learning in general, am I yet a college-educated person who intends to send my children to college? If I'm still behaving in all of these ways, it seems like I might tell one story, namely that, I've got no confidence or whatever, but maybe I actually just do, and I'm just terrible at recognizing that I do. And so what if it could be the case that, in fact, a lot of these institutions are fine and doing what they should be doing, but we have a terrible perception problem that could be explained in a lot of ways. It could be explained by the way I'd like to explain it is that the fact that they're working well, frankly, gives me the luxury to like sit, in the mezzanine and be a critic of like how terrible all these institutions are. Again, as I drink clean water and send my kid to a school I think is fine, right? But it could be other explanations as well, right? To like, it could be availability bias issues, right? So it could be very, very well be the case that access to information is better than it's ever been. And it may very well be the case that instances, say, of like you said, like corruption or whatever, maybe those things happen at a rate exactly the same or even less than they used to, but my access to information about them is so much better. And so since that access is what's readily available to me, I grossly overestimate the degree to which those things are occurring. And therefore I report, the sky is falling or whatever. I also wonder about, I don't know if you're familiar with a book by David Whitman called The Optimism Gap, but he synthesizes a lot of work done in about the past 50 years that consistently shows that we actually, the vast majority of us in America tend to report fairly significant optimism about our local state of affairs, my kid's school, my church, my job, but we have this massive pessimism when it comes to things at the national level. What's crazy about that, right, is that there's this majority of people who say that. So we can't all be right about both of those claims, right? Either if the majority of us really are happy with our local situation, then there isn't this crisis at the national situation. But we, for some reason, I don't know, can't perspective take that far, something like that. But point being, I wonder then if, to sum up, to recap what I was trying to pitch here, I wonder if there's not something to explain in the way that you might have lined out. What if what needs to be explained is, like, again, a terrible self-awareness problem where we don't realize, like, actually things are working just fine. We have it pretty sweet. And if we were asked the question at a more local level, we would report, hey, I am a active member at my church. I am on the PTA at my kid's school. But instead what we get asked are these sort of like, you know, huge level questions, and that's where the breakdown is. We're bad at self-perceiving how well off things actually are.
Okay. James.
Well, I am for sure the least credentialed member of this panel, probably the least impressive of them, a little intimidated for even being on here with you guys. And I guess my role is I'm going to be Pollyanna here, or otherwise known as maybe devil's advocate, just a little bit. But I think as I was reading through and looking at this crisis of institutions, one of the things that struck me is it feels like that the crisis isn't so much as a lack of faith in institutions, but too much faith in institutions, and I think in political institutions to be sure. We have this expectation of them that they can produce more than they actually are designed to produce, and that expectation drives up the stakes for control of those institutions, to get them to perform those molding roles and shaping. We want them to shape people in the way that we want them to be shaped. And so you have this ever higher increasing stakes game of competition for control of those institutions. And that exacerbates the polarization that we see happening. And as that competition grows more divisive, and the belief that the power of control over those institutions can in some way create the good society, to me, just continues to increase this perception that we lack trust, because what we really lack is trust in institutions controlled by other people, not necessarily the institutions that we control. And so to me, that was the first thing I came across of. I'm going to follow up with something Dr. Crain mentioned and answer a question that you asked in kind of your introduction, which is unreasonable to suggest that the frustration that so many feel is from delusional. And I'm going to say, yes, they are delusional, to at least to a certain extent, right? And I don't blame them. We have a mass media culture that hypes, as Dr. Crain said, hypes the negative. There's a reason the old news saying is, if it bleeds, it leads. Whether we're talking local news, national news, whether we're talking internet-based stuff or whatever, the focus is the negative. And when all we get is the negative, and we don't hear nearly as much about the positive, that is going to have an impact and shape how we view the larger world around us. And so we may think, hey, things seem to be okay where I'm at in my little community, but see all of this negative out and about in other places and say, but the world is going to hell in a handbasket otherwise. And so I think to a certain extent, books that tell us that the world is ending sell better than books that tell us things are going well. So we have all of this negativity that is, and it eats at us, and we get this unhealthy feeling that things are much worse off than they are. And that's revealed in much of the survey work that you mentioned. But I think, that you combine the fact that we don't do a good job of explaining why we're at where we're at, right? How is it, as you acknowledge in your book, how is it that we have all of this material benefit around us? How is it that we have ways of staying connected? And that really hit me back in July. My family got hit by COVID, and my oldest daughter was out of state at the time she came down with it and went into an ICU room for about 5 or 6 days. And had we not been able to text, and had we not been able to do a Zoom with her, we would have virtually no communication with her. And so this technology, and it impressed upon me how much different the interaction would be between people if this had happened when I was her age, or when I was a little bit younger in high school in the 80s. And we had no internet and no Zoom and no texting, you know. So to a certain extent, you know, I think we don't do a good job of explaining how did this occur. And as we're feeling the frustrations, and I really don't want to discount the frustration that is there, and with this eating at us, that there is something more than just this material benefit that we see around us. But how is it that got here? What is the processes that led to that? And what can help us make that material benefit that we see, that we enjoy, connect us more rather than separate us, as we seem to be experiencing. So I think for me, that was something that stood out as well. The chapter on the family I thought was very interesting, and just a couple of things that I would throw out to you is that maybe we're not living through a collapse of family forms as much as we're living through a revision of family forms. Maybe what we're seeing is new forms of the family emerge that are going to lead to greater human flourishing because they're adapting to changing circumstances, changing times, changing opportunities that people are presented with. I think that we've seen the family institution change over time historically, right? I mean, there was a time where you had, you know, not just the nuclear, what we consider the nuclear family, but you had grandparents who were living in the home. You had arranged marriages, you had primogeniture, all of these kinds of things. All of those things have moved and transitioned away. So I don't know that we can necessarily assume that the status of the family as it has emerged, say in the late the 1900s, for over the 1900s and into the 21st century, I don't know that we should automatically assume that that's the natural state of the family, and that its form would not change as society changes as well. And so I would just throw that out there to think on too. So, but I really enjoyed it. It spoke, your writing did speak to kind of my conservative roots of growing up, the importance of religious institutions and the family, these kinds of things. And I certainly appreciated that. My more libertarian leanings kind of lead me to a little bit of criticisms, but I do want to say I've enjoyed the read so far.
Yuval, would you like to chime in at this point?
Oh, he's muted.
As if I hadn't just seen at least two people do that. I've been doing it for 6 months. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the comments and the careful reading and thoughtful responses to the book. I'll try to hit on as much of that as I can relatively quickly, having taken some notes on these good points and questions. It is certainly true that this book is rooted in a kind of conservative communitarian view, and that it harkens to a moment when that view was prominent in a way that it isn't now. And, you know, that was also a moment in some ways when there was a liberal communitarianism that was quite prominent and powerful too. Some of that is still around in Michael Sandel's work and a few other people, but certainly not in the way that it was in the late 80s, early 90s. For me, that view is rooted especially in the work of Robert Nisbet, which reaches further back than that, and his work, especially beginning with the Quest for Community in the 50s. The striking thing about that, and it speaks to James's point and also to Guy's, is that Nisbet was extremely pessimistic about the state of American community in the early 1950s. And, you know, we always have to ask ourselves, what do we make of these kind of, you know, premature prophets, people who seem to us like they're speaking about today when they were writing long before. The 1950s was a golden age of community in America, from my point of view. Robert Nisbet didn't think so. He thought everything was falling apart. Alexis de Tocqueville thought that about the 1830s. So either they were right or and are still right, or they were wrong and are right now, or they're just wrong. And there's just a disposition a way of looking at American life that is always too pessimistic. I actually think there's some truth to that last view, but that it's also useful and constructive to be concerned with the state of community at any time. I certainly do think, though, that there are some distinct problems in contemporary America that have to do, or that at least are made easier to understand if we see them through the lens of community. It is worth seeing that these are concerns that have always been with us, and especially they're concerns about liberalism. I mean, I think Ryan got at this too. They're rooted in the notion that the liberal society is too individualistic for its own good and needs to be balanced some by a sense that the individual can only really flourish when embedded in some larger whole. And that kind of concern presents itself in different ways in just about every generation in the life of every liberal society. And I certainly would not deny that that's the framework in which I operate. I don't think that this is some new, entirely novel condition in the human experience that has to be explained from scratch. I think this is a recurring problem in every generation. And as there is a need for liberals in every generation, there is a need for some criticism of liberalism to keep it in balance in every generation. The language, the specifics are a little different in each generation because the circumstances are. There are different technologies, for example, in our situation that affect this. There are different political circumstances. There are inequalities in American life now that are distinct to this moment. But the underlying problem is fundamental. And in that sense, I certainly would plead guilty to pointing to a permanent problem, not to a new problem. But I think there's a lot to be gained by this kind of communitarianism, provided it is seen as a balance. I certainly wouldn't offer it as an alternative to liberalism, as some people do, and some people in that age of conservative communitarianism did. I'm a liberal. I mean, I believe in the free society, and those opening words of the Declaration of Independence speak for me. I think equality is the right organizing principle for our society. I also think that we need to be cognizant of the ways in which a society organized around those ideals can go astray, and that sometimes what it needs to be reminded of are the kind of communitarian ideals that are ultimately essential to human flourishing, but that we in particular incline to forget. There are societies that incline to forget the opposite, that are very overbearing and communitarian, and need to be reminded that every person has dignity and that every person should have some choice in life. Our society doesn't need to be reminded of that. I think our society needs to be reminded that we are each individual parts of a larger whole. And when we forget that, we do suffer these rather extreme morale problems that become very practical problems. So that, to one of Guy's points, I certainly think that people do express in their revealed preferences a greater amount of trust in some of the infrastructure of our common life than they say they have. And not just in terms of, we drink the water, but we live trusting lives. We just assume things will work, and they generally do. But I do think that we are in a moment in American life now that is a low point for that sort of trust too, and that people are inclined to believe that the institutions of our society exist for others and not for them, and that it does lead to some people actually expressing in practice less trust, pulling out of what could be communal institutions, coming to see themselves as part of subcultures that are somehow hostile to the larger culture, and so not participating, say, in the public schools or in political life, and isolating themselves out of a sense of fear. I mean, there's an enormous amount of fear in our politics right now, fear of the opposite party. And what our polarization really amounts to is a sense that the other party is the country's biggest problem. And I think that makes it very difficult for some of our core institutions to function, so that becomes a real problem, not just a problem of perception. I'm sure I'm missing quite a lot, but just in the interest of not taking up all the time, maybe I should stop there.
The idea of drinking water, I just kept thinking of Flint, Michigan when people use that reference. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's we do trust our water, but sometimes there are reasons why people can't. The idea of community seems so, you know, it's an easy word that people use, and it always sounds good. Communities, though, inherently, they exist by dint of the boundaries that they set vis-a-vis something external to the community. And I think that is, in some ways, when I listen to what James in particular was saying, there is, we do distinguish, or we should distinguish, I guess, between the kind of institutions that are very micro, like, you know, the ones that are constitutive of our primary, you know, associations, and then the broader ones, the ones that we might be, you know, that we might have a more ambivalent or perhaps hostile attitude towards. There is, you know, communities they overlap, they nest, you know, they're one inside the other, and I think that their vigor and the value that they would represent in a kind of framework such as this book provides is their inherent localness. And the extent that you get farther and farther away from that localness, you arrive at. I was struck by something that you quoted Mark Zuckerberg in your in the piece on the chapter on social media, he used this expression global community, which I find to be incoherent. Right? There can't be a global community. There can be communities within a global environment, but the idea of a community only makes sense if it's inherently, if it's capable of distinguishing between its inside and its outside. And to the extent that you expand that concept, it loses what I think is what makes it a meaningful one in the first place. And so, you know, if there is an agenda, I suppose, in this book, I feel like I'm speaking for the author, which is really presumptuous. It's that institutional revival implies inherently at least some degree of devolution of power downward, and that you find that you begin that renewal by doing whatever is necessary in order to make those local institutions more powerful, more relevant, more purposive than they previously were. And I see, in terms of public policy, I see it going in different directions. I see scope for a kind of, you know, welfare state version of this, you know, in the way in which Germany, for example, runs its welfare state through intermediary associations like labor unions and churches, thereby invigorating them and providing them with a functionality that sets in motion that character formation that perhaps we're interested in. There is a left-wing version, there's a right-wing version, I think, but I think that the common feature is that scale matters, and that bringing things down to scale. You mentioned Jane Jacobs in your book at one point, I recall, and there's nothing intrinsically kind of contradictory between a kind of cosmopolitan perspective and one that values the things that are intrinsically local. Those things are not necessarily at odds with each other. And I think that the fact that isn't means that a book like this, it really does, it does speak across, I think, conventional political lines.
Well, I appreciate that. That's certainly my hope in this. And I do think that there is very much a left-wing and a right-wing version of this concern and of some of the ways forward. And I would also say, I think institutions are almost inherently, maybe not necessarily local, but are almost inherently interpersonal at some level. So that when I think about Congress, for example, Congress has national scope responsibilities, but Congress is a mid-sized institution. It has 535 people. And the way that it works is much more shaped by that than by the fact that it plays a role in our national politics and that its decisions are national in scale. In thinking about how it can work better, it makes more sense to think about the members of Congress as, in fact, members, as belonging to this larger whole, than to think of it as sitting at the top of a kind of pyramid and exercising power nationally. So that part of what it means to think institutionally is almost necessarily to think at that level of interpersonal incentives and relationships, and ultimately also formation in this way.
Any questions perhaps from either the other panelists or from the audience?
I'd like to bring up one more thing. I take it some of the polarization that you're mentioning, there was work done around 2015, I think, by Liliana Mason trying to describe, say, maybe what we're taking to be ideological polarization is not in fact ideological polarization. Maybe it's an affective polarization whereas we might have like significant agreement with each other if we're asked the right sort of like policy scale issues. Turns out we might still express like a lot of disdain for people that wear a different jersey, right? So she did some survey work where she asked people questions, Likert scale questions about like, how happy or unhappy would you be if your child were to marry a member of the opposite political party? And what was interesting is that, you know, strong partisans expressed like deep unhappiness about that, even when on the actual policy questions that they answered, there wasn't significant difference. You know, we were talking about people barely left to right of center in terms of their actual policy positions. Okay. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but there was follow-up work done on that by Samara Klar in 2018, where what she altered about the earlier work was not this, would your child marry a member of your party or the other party? What she did was alter what that would mean. So instead of just asking people, she asked some people that very question, but then she asked, and the person that your child marries will rarely talk about politics. And then another group will frequently talk about politics. And what she found was the sort of affective polarization that Mason had detected really melted away. And what she found was there was this polarization between people who wanted to be hyper involved and people who did not want to be hyper involved, such that when even strong partisans were asked, how happy or unhappy would you be if your child married a member of the same party who was going to frequently talk about politics, happiness ratings went down. And so I'm wondering how that might relate to your work. In other words, like, are we just getting sort of like the rifts wrong? What we're getting, why are we seeing this rift? Because those are the hyper-involved people as opposed to people who aren't. And if you're watching the outliers battle it out, yeah, it looks terrible, right? But what if it really is even people who would, on the whole, like to be involved, they don't want to be diehard fanatics, and like that's what's off-putting. That's the rift. Like, man, I can't, you know, I can't even like do anything without it. I can't in our own day and time. If I wear a mask and comply with a mandate, if I don't wear a mask, it's not merely COVID related anymore. It is like putting on the enemy jersey to other people, and it's like, wow, I can't. I instantly have to be extreme no matter what I do. I wonder. Is there a place for that rift in the kind of in what you're trying to diagnose, or is that really a challenge to your view?
Yeah, well, it is a challenge in a way, but you know, I first of all, I think it gets at the longstanding question in political science about whether polarization is an elite phenomenon or a broad public phenomenon. Which and you know, I think there are very strong arguments on both sides, but I'm very much inclined to be persuaded by the view that it is largely an elite phenomenon. That polarization, what we think of as intense partisan polarization, that is ideological in character, is really something that you find among highly educated and very engaged Americans. But I think we've seen, especially in this century, what you're describing, which is a transformation of that into a kind of identity polarization where, you know, people on the right can't stand people on the left, and it's not because they've got strong views about marginal tax rates. It's cultural. It's just a sense that these are other people and that they're other people in every way, and that ultimately, not only are they on the other team, they're the problem. And what the election is about is getting rid of them. Not about changing this or that public policy, but clearing out those people and putting in our people. And that view is much more widespread than the kind of genuinely, I think, elite ideological polarization that the parties sometimes think they're engaged in. They sort of have these policy debates that are about policy questions. But one of the things the Trump era has really showed us is that a lot of this is really fundamentally cultural. And people are almost willing to reverse their positions if that's what their team is doing. So that, views on trade, views on spending have sort of shifted around because this is where we are now. And so that's what we believe now. I think that kind of polarization is sociocultural in a very complicated way for us. It has to do with levels of education. It has to do with geographic sorting. Some of it is certainly also ethnic and racial. And it becomes a much more profound, in the sense that it's both broader and deeper kind of social division. And there's certainly a way in which our politics has moved in that direction and has become, I started with this problem that people in my line of work face, which is we just don't have policy arguments anymore. Nobody's really interested in hearing about marginal tax rates because that's just not what we're fighting about. And, I think understanding our politics in this moment requires thinking about some of the underlying infrastructural challenges that are more about community and affiliation and belonging and who are we and what do we mean by we, than they are about the direction of public policy in one area or another. So that it's compelled somebody like me who tends to work in the public policy space to try to think in this broader way about what is underlying our cultural politics and our political culture. And, I think in this sense, our problems are deeper than traditional policy and political problems. And they are about identity and they are about community. That's why I ended up in this space, really.
So if I could follow up on that, as a political scientist who is particularly interested in information technology and politics, I'm wondering whether or not, it seems my impression of your chapter on social media would sort of leads me to the conclusion that you view the internet as a threat to democracy. And your sort of answer to what ails the United States is that we need to renew our institutions through prioritizing institutions over the self. I think you rightly note that social media sort of works against that, at least social media in its present form works against that. So what I'm wondering is, do you think it's possible to develop governing institutions that allow us to harness whatever is socially beneficial from social media while preventing that which is socially / politically harmful from social media? And if so, what would those institutions look like?
Yeah, I'm sure you could see in that chapter that this is a question I'm wrestling with and that I don't have an answer to that I'm comfortable with. I think we have to think about information technology as a set of tools so that the way we use it reveals something about what we want. I'm not inclined to think that the problem we have is created by the technology, but rather that the fact that we choose to use these technologies in this way tells us something about that problem. We could use them in a different way. There's nothing, divinely ordained about the nature of contemporary social media or the legal environment around it or anything else in this space. We could do it differently, but we do it this way because this is what we want out of it. And so it exacerbates some of these problems, but it didn't create them. I do think that, I think we need to have greater clarity about what responsibility entails in that space, what corporate responsibility entails, what public responsibility entails and what individual responsibility does. And I think all of those now, because we're early in this new world and we're still new to it all, I think all of that is very confused at the moment, and people are trying to shove it into categories where it doesn't belong. Categories created in the progressive movement to govern the industrial economy, which don't quite make a lot of sense for governing the information economy. I think there's a lot of need for political science that thinks through how our society can handle this challenge. I don't pretend to know the answer to that question. I certainly think it's a very important set of questions, and that there's a greater role for public policy than we now see in action. I'm a conservative. I think government should be limited, but there's a role here. So there's something missing here in how we're governing ourselves in this space. And, you know, there's a job for political scientists and for citizens and for legislators to think about what that needs to involve. I don't pretend to know, though.
Have you, if I may, just do a quick follow-up. I'm curious if you've gotten into any of the literature in political science on regulating and or governing the internet.
Yeah, some in the course of the work on that chapter and other work I have. And, you know, I think we still lack some clarity about the questions we're trying to answer in that space. But, you know, there's an increasingly interesting set of debates about it in our politics and among political scientists. I think it's going to be very interesting on the right and the left in different ways. People like Josh Hawley on the right, the senator from Missouri, who is very aggressive about the need to regulate the internet, and in many ways is aligned with people like Dick Durbin and others on the left. I think they're much closer to each other than either one of them is to the rest of their party, and that's the kind of issue that can spark new thinking.
I think the challenge to domestic regulation of the internet, however, is the accomplishment, and I'm going to say accomplishment in certain quotation marks, by the Clinton administration to get the internet protected under the World Trade Organization as a duty-free trade zone. And that sort of creates a bit of a challenge as it relates to what type of content that we can adequately regulate on the internet. It also speaks, I think, to the approach to internet governance domestically, but also globally, that is very much rooted in an American conception of liberalism, right? So the Clinton administration pursued World Trade Organization protections for the internet because it viewed the internet as a solution to its campaign promise in 1992 to expand American exports by $1 billion by the year 2000. And so it sort of saw the internet as the tool by which American businesses, particularly small businesses, could evolve into export-driven businesses. Of course, the platform then, the internet then becomes sort of this tool for expanding American products and political ideals overseas. I'm wondering if your sort of conservative communitarian framework might be able to assist with illuminating how this sort of this approach to internet governance has been misguided and may provide some concrete policy recommendations for regulating and governing the internet. I'll stop there because I'll continue to sort of pick on this issue of internet governance, something that I'm a bit passionate about. But thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I would just say, Ryan, whatever's happened in the intervening 20 years, in terms of the original intentions, the internet has been immensely destructive of our previous institutional configuration, I'm thinking here particularly of the news media, the old business model is dead, and we have nothing really, nothing that replaces it that provides the same kind of, editorial gatekeeping and barriers that we took for granted once upon a time in a world with newspapers and, things, whose content were controlled in a much more pluralistic fashion.
That, Loren, but with artificial intelligence, we're rapidly entering an era where it will be impossible to control.
Great.
The news cycle, because we're going to be having AI generated news, but and deep fake videos and all that kind of fun stuff that.
There's actually a good one of Zuckerberg that I would recommend. In any event, as a prerogative of chair, I think we're going to come to a close pretty soon, unless people have something else they want to ask. I do want to just throw out one more thing that has to do with the word identity, which has been used several times in the course of this discussion. Yuval, do you think that identity, and in the sense of identity politics, is I mean, I know your chapter on the campus politics is pretty fair-minded. It looks very different from institutions at our level, though, than the ones that you write about. That's very definite. But the idea of identity politics, is this, do you consider that inherently a problematic thing, in the sense that identity politics is what we resort to because we've lost the institutional we've lost the institutional roles that a properly functioning institution would have otherwise conferred on us. That formative effect of healthy institutions is being sort of supplanted by a identity politics, which is inherently disconnected from institutions. I mean, people claim identity, and it's one of these. It's not something that it's entirely non-localized. You can't ground it necessarily in a social, political, or cultural institution. It's a set of claims that people make of a very distinctly zero-sum nature that seem to me to be inherently, they're problematic with respect to the kind of institutional renewal that you're suggesting. Am I reading that correctly, or is that?
Yeah, no, that's certainly my view. I mean, I think that it is also fundamentally expressive and not formative. That is, it's not a way of becoming something. It's just a way of showing what you are, and that makes it very difficult for it to play a constructive role in our culture. And I think it stands in for institutions that would be formative. Now, look, it's not totally negative. I mean, in that chapter and elsewhere, I think that it speaks to a need, to a hunger, that is a hunger for something constructive and right and just. But it speaks to it in a way that is not very constructive at all, it seems to me, in a way that assumes the absence of functional institutions and provides instead a kind of static identity that encourages team spirit, that encourages a kind of a static, unthinking, expressive affiliation. And especially in an academic environment, that just seems to me to be completely at odds with what a university should be for its students. So I certainly worry about it enormously.
Yeah. You write about basically about elite institutions in your chapter. There's one section though that I had to smile about, and that was your comments about school administration. I think that at least at a place like University of Central Oklahoma, and I can't speak for Rose State or any of our sister institutions, but there is identity politics is clearly a factor in university life, but it's mostly you find it mostly in terms of it's been incorporated into human resource, into the HR. We don't even call it HR; it's people and culture now. So it's become part of it's a baked-in ideology of the administration. We don't have people running around canceling people, or I mean, we have none of that kind of stuff at this level of American higher education. What we do have, though, is a university administration that has bought into diversity and inclusion and is now, it's now baked into our faculty handbook, and there's no political controversy, which is, unlike what you find, I think, on more elite at universities, but it's very real nonetheless. I mean, it's you don't find people running around having hurt feelings about this, that, or the other thing. But what you do find is that a certain kind of set of political conclusions about identity are now, they're part of standard operating procedure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to see that also teaches the students something about how the world works, about how institutions work, about how authority works. That may not be thought through, or maybe it is thought through, but institutions can't help but shape us. And so the question is not whether a university shapes its students, but how. This kind of approach to personnel and administration certainly shapes the students as they enter the larger world.
20 or 30 years ago, back when I was a young student of Dr. Gatch's at UCO, there was a lot of discussion of the institutions of civil society, and it seems like we don't talk about those much anymore. But talking about the very institutions you're talking about, family, church, Rotary clubs, chambers of commerce, these kinds of institutions that teach social cooperation, absent, the government control, government obligation, the partisanship that you see in politics and democratic politics. And I think it's interesting that in the chapter that you mentioned, you talk about religious institutions. One of the things that struck me was it's interesting that especially those evangelical Christians in the United States, as over the last 30 or 40 years, they have turned to looking to the apparatus of the state as a mechanism for ushering in their version of the kingdom of heaven, if you will. It doesn't seem coincidental to me that the trust of religious institutions abroad has declined significantly, and I thought I'd get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to the point you raised at the beginning, that we don't talk as much about these institutions, I think that's true. They're still there. They're still very important. It gets to Ryan's point that there was a moment in the 80s and 90s when discussion of this was really out there in the ether. It was part of not only political science and sociology, but political life in a pretty different way than is now the case. So that while these institutions still matter at least as much in the lives of Americans, and for many they work well, and they're very important, we don't talk about them nearly as much as we seem to. And I agree. I mean, I think the politicization of civil society institutions necessarily makes them harder to trust. And we've certainly seen that in American religious life, where people channel their the kinds of passions and priorities that would be channeled through civil society much more through politics now. Again, in different ways on the left and the right, but very related ways. There's a mirror image there that neither side would be very comfortable acknowledging, but that I think speaks to the breadth of the problem.
Yeah.
All right. I think that we're going to call this to a close unless anyone else has anything they want to say.
Only thank you.
Okay. Well, we've had the pleasure and the honor of Yuval Levin participating in our discussion of his book, A Time to Build. And thank God for the pandemic and making people Zoom and do that kind of stuff, because I don't think we would ever have had an author speak to us in a format like this. Thank you very much for participating, all of you. And this should be recorded and uploaded, I think. Is that how it works, James? On the OPSA website?
So I think because we made you the host,
yes,
it'll record on your end. So just save that to your computer.
All right.
And then I'll email you how to upload that somewhere. We get the link to Shanna.
Okay. Well, good. Well, everyone have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks for participating.